Hi, Sam.
Hey, Ayad.
Welcome to the 92nd Street Y, on the occasion of your debut novel coming out. We know each other from many years ago because I met you when you were 9, I think, the first time. I knew your mom. It was complicated to read your book because I wasn't sure, and to talk to you because I wasn't sure whether to talk to you about Evan or talk to you about you. And that really is my first question. Why a novel, considering how close to your life you're working?
Well, Evan is my middle name.
So, I clearly didn't know you well enough to know that.
Thanks for being here. And a middle name felt right to give this character because he's part of me, but not all of me. People are too complex to turn into discrete characters in a work of art. I mean, even if you were Knausgaard or Proust, and John only gave me 300 pages, not 3,000. But there's a deeper question here. The book is based on a memoir essay that I wrote, and people are, of course, interested in the facts of my life. I'm asked this all the time. Well, you have an interesting life, so why not write a memoir? But the ambition of any artist is to create a work of art that is larger than the experiences that go into that work. Simply offering the facticity of one's own life, this isn't satisfying to any novelist. And from an early age, I mean, from about the time that you met me when I was 9, what I know how I felt my fullest self is when I was writing, right? And so, why did I write a novel? Well, because I'm a novelist.
Sure.
This is a work of art that's also deeply concerned with the experience of making sense of our lives through works of art. So, the version of my mother who we encounter in this book is a young woman in 1970s New York who's gone through difficult experiences and is trying to come to terms with who she is in this world through acting on the stage. She's playing Hedda Gabler. She's developing this deep, intimate relationship to Hedda and trying to understand how can she become a fuller version of herself through this character. My mother's character, as was true, my mother meets Dylan in this period. And he's going through deep personal and artistic crisis in 1974, and he's trying to understand how does he take the anguish he's living through and turn that into the music that becomes blood on the tracks. And we see him do that in this book. And then Evan, my character, he's a young man who's left home. He's traveled into the world. He's tried to become a writer, but he hasn't written something that's to him. He hasn't actualized himself as an artist, and now in his mid-20s, he's come home, his mother is sick. He has this quiet time with her when he can think deeply about what actually matters in life. And the journey that he's on is toward understanding that what he's been missing as an artist, he's got a great education, he's experienced the world, but there's no spiritual depth to his work, there's no wisdom. What he's overlooked is his mother's wisdom. And he needs to integrate that into his work to create a work of art that is redemptive. So I wanted all of that to be clear in this book. And I thought if it was a memoir, it would be read for facticity. It wouldn't be understood as a work of art that's trying to ask these deeper questions about why all of us draw deep meaning in our life.
I mean, I responded to the book beyond whether it was a memoir or a novel, just in relation to the truth that it was expressing. I was so taken by the book and by its sincerity. Just maybe rewind a little bit and take us back to sort of the circumstance of what happened. So the book begins, Evan gets a call from his mother, and she tells him that she is sick, something he didn't know. And he's in London, and he comes home. And what unfolds from there is a process of being with her through tests and then chemotherapy, and a slow unspooling disclosure about who his father might be. Can you tell us a little bit about that strand of, I mean, it's part of what the book is about.
Yeah, and also who she is.
We're going to get there, don't worry. I know you don't want to talk about this part as much as you want to talk about that part. I knew your mom too. She was an extraordinary person. I cannot wait to talk about her. But let's talk about this part, and then we'll get to that next part.
Yeah. So, my mother, Evan's mother, had this relationship with Dylan. And, when I was a teenager, at first, well, you want to talk about me? You want to talk about Evan?
Yeah, I want to, well, sure, whatever you, that's what I would,
well, we have
came in asking the question
we
about.
have this experience in common.
Yeah.
So the character, Evan, when he's a teenager, he's told often, you have a physical resemblance to Dylan. And at first this is flattering, he starts listening to Dylan's music. He likes it. He identifies with him as an artist. And then he learns his mother had a relationship with Dylan. And at first she says...
It's technically, by the way, a very difficult thing to pull off, the way that you introduced your interest with Dylan as a child or as a young person, and then the disclosure after that about about Evan's mother's relationship with Dylan. And so anyway, just want to say kudos on a craft level. That was great. So.
Thank you. I had good source notes. But she's never wanted to talk about this. So she said first she says, no, I didn't know him. Then she says, well, I knew him, but long before you were born. And then she says, well, maybe our relationship began long before you were born. And she says, and we saw each other again the year before you were born. And she doesn't want to say anything else. So Evan leaves home, goes out into the world trying to become an artist on his own terms. And he's lived abroad for these 8 years, and he now comes home only when she is sick. And for the first time, she begins speaking to him about this earlier period of her life. And she brings him back to the world that made her who she is, this bohemian 1970s artistic world that really was the Upper East Side. And my mother lived in the same apartment in which I live now, which is 14 blocks from here. And she's studying with Norman Rabin, the painter who's the youngest child of Shalom Aleichem at Carnegie Hall. And she's studying with Stella Adler. And she's beginning to tell this story of who she was at the same age that Evan is when she was trying to become an artist in the way that he is now in his life. And of course, part of that is Dylan. She meets Dylan in a painting class.
With Norman Rabin.
With Norman Rabin.
Right.
And
I know that that's what happens in the book, but is that how they met?
It is how they met.
Okay.
It is how they met. It's a great story.
It is.
Again, Dylan has come to Rabin because he's going through this deep artistic crisis. He's in his early 30s. He feels he hasn't written anything worthwhile since the first half of his 20s. And he hears about Rabin, this artist who has a way of drawing out of other artists through painting what is most true in themselves. And so he comes to Rabin's class.
Let's turn off the phones, guys. Come on. For real.
So he comes to Rabin's class, and Rabin had a practice where at the end of a day, everyone would go around and criticize each other's canvases. And when this was done for Dylan...
There's a great scene where they do that for Dylan. Yeah.
Another scene on which I had good source notes. Yeah. And so, people are saying things to him like, oh, this canvas looks like your lyrics sound. But of course, that's not why he's there. He doesn't want to be idolized. He doesn't want to be revered. He's there because he's in artistic crisis, right? Because he's trying to learn and grow as an artist. And she says to him, this canvas is uninviting. The colors are too harsh, right? And he's suddenly taken by this. Who is this 20-year-old who's talking to me, famous, accomplished man, this way? And so he starts talking to her, and the first time that they spent together, it's a very good story. It's in the book, but also drawn from life. He says to her, you should really host a party
Yeah.
for the class. Well, it was just sort of a wild thing. I mean, she's living in this small, old apartment. He's Dylan, obviously, he could have a party wherever he wants. And he says, yeah, host a party, invite everyone over. So she has a party in the apartment, and, he's Dylan. He's standoffish. He doesn't really talk to anyone. He flicks through her record collection. Yeah. At one point...
Did she have any records of his?
No. Yeah. She loved telling that detail.
Yeah.
And so the last guest leaves about 2 a.m, and Dylan walks the guest to the door. He's wearing red cowboy boots, and he presses the door shut with his boots. And he turns to my mother and he says, well, that was boring. And this
the rest for readers to encounter. Your mom, your mom was so remarkable. I met her in 2000, knew her probably through 2015, and she was such a support to me through so many years of struggle as an artist, as a writer. She's strangely, oddly, never told me she was an actor, which is so interesting to me, considering so many things that I learned about Evan's mother, which seemed to be, they tracked things that I suspected but didn't know. She was at Bennington in the book. Evan's mother, June, is at Bennington in the book and drops out of Bennington and comes to New York to make her way. And she finds her way at first into Stella Adler's class. Can you tell us what that relationship in the book between Stella Adler and June is like?
Well, part of what I'm interested in the book and in life is how are artistic traditions passed along? What is that intergenerational relationship like? And, the two teachers in this book, Stella Adler and Norman Rabin, they're people who would be almost unrecognizable to us today. The way that they worked is that they each had studios, and anyone could walk into that studio. They didn't care if you'd gone to college. My mother, as you said, had dropped out of Bennington. They didn't want to see a resume. They didn't care what your credentials were. There was one credential to study with Stella Adler or Norman Rabin. Are you willing to be yelled at until I turn you into an artist? And most people weren't. Right. And they'd leave the class. Right? But my mother, let's say the character in the book, is after something about herself. She understands that acting is a way to understand more deeply who she is. And Stella Adler is saying to her time and time again, don't worry about being celebrated. Don't worry about what role you get. Don't worry about applause. In the book, Adler comes to every show that June does, but she leaves before the end. And June always wants her to be there at the end of the show, to put her hand on her shoulder and say, well done. There's a moment where Stella Adler says, if you're fishing for a compliment, go look in some other lake. Right? And by the end of those chapters and that storyline, June understands what Stella is talking about. She has an experience playing Hedda Gabler where she feels this is what it means to act, and I don't care if everyone is applauding or no one is applauding because I've achieved the character. That's what it means.
The book is very wise about coming of age. It's a coming of age story about a young man, and there's a little passage here I want to read. It really touched me. I cried a couple of times too, John, and once for myself as a young, aspiring, yearning artist. You articulated so beautifully the desire to live more fully and deeply through and because of and for art, and what that meant, and the way that that lives in those studios with Stella Adler and Rabin, and why Dylan is there, and why your mother is there, and what the pursuit of truth really is. But it's a coming of age for a young man who wants to be a writer, It's a coming-of-age story that a mother tells to her son, her coming of age. And it's remarkably, I mean, really, this is the thing that John alluded to in the introduction. You're telling Dylan's coming of age, and you pull it off. I mean, how did you do that? How did you imagine yourself into the mind of a man who might be your father and not have, I don't know, intervening, supervening emotions that would prevent you from seeing clearly what that process was? What was the process of setting that down in words? How did you do that?
I have no idea.
But you did it, Sam. So what was that like?
I was writing this novel in the apartment where the relationship began, where my mother was living in 1974. And when I was writing those scenes, there were times I would close my eyes and imagine the two of them in this room and try to feel my way through what she had told me, through her account of what it was like to be there. And for me, that was an artistic meeting, that she's in that room becoming Hedda, and he's in that room writing Blood on the Tracks, and I'm in that room trying to write what became Boy from the North Country.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. It's what you just said, those three things, and what all of them learn. Can you read, we talked about a section about chopping wood and whatnot. Do you mind reading that for the...
With joy.
Where the hell did we put this thing? Oh, here it is. Can you set it up just briefly?
My mother was such a complex person, and one of the great artistic challenges I faced in writing this book is, how do I take the person who I've loved most in my life and put her into a book, into a character, right? And I tried to capture the range of who she was, and this is from the vantage point of my childhood, and I think that's all we need to know heading in. On winter afternoons, we walked into the snow in our warmest coats, my mother carrying her wooden axe. Standing over maple trunks that fell in that year's storm, she lifted the axe high overhead and swung it into the fallen trees. The rhythmic thudding echoed as I wandered the forest, searching for kindling. Sometimes the sound paused, and I turned to see my mother struggling with the axe overhead. The blade struck in the round cut of wood. A woman in a green winter jacket with auburn hair about her shoulders and a fierce glare in her eyes. She heaved the axe and cut of wood to the ground, pressed her black boot to the heart of the wood, and withdrew the axe with a sharp breath. We carried the wood to the iron grate beside the fireplace. My mother set our burnt offering in the stove. She lit a match and set the flame beneath the kindling and stoked the fire with a rusted steel poker. The flames blazed and the warmth spread through the den, and my mother said, "Where shall we go tonight?" Once each year, we ventured to the city. We rose early in the morning, shoveled snow from the driveway, and glided in her station wagon down the forest highway. At the bridge with views of the city, we met a stream of cars, and I began to worry if we were all going to fit into the theater. Then, with relief, I remembered that there was more than one theater in New York. Curious about the destination of our fellow theatergoers, I stared through the car window, wondering if that mustached man might seek a stern lecture by Arthur Miller or a heartwarming romance such as Beauty and the Beast. Perhaps he will surprise us all by walking straight into Cats. At the theater, she gave her name and received 2 tickets, in exchange in which she seemed to gain the better bargain. We sat in enchanted anticipation as the audience took their seats and the actors came on stage. Then the figures began to enact the Ibsen or Chekhov drama we had traveled this great distance to enjoy. And I was mesmerized to see my mother, who the day before had split a fallen maple tree into firewood, reciting to herself the actor's every line.
You were saying that was, maybe you were 5 or 6 when you first remember your mom. Because I asked you what play was it, you're like, I don't know, I was 5 or 6. So. And that's remarkable. So your mom, Evan's mom in the book, gets sick. She is sick, and she is undergoing chemotherapy. And it's in these sessions of chemotherapy that the story that Evan wants to know about his past begins to come out, which is, of course, also the areas, those are the areas of the book where you have this very deft coming-of-age tale that you tell about Dylan. I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that the ending is hard. There's a lot of grief in the book. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it meant. You started writing the book how shortly after your own mother passed away?
3 years.
3 years. What was that like to write with that level of grief and about that kind of grief?
Well, I was with my mother, as in the book, at the end of her life, and that was the most emotionally raw and searing experience that I've had as a person. Sharing the last months of her life, knowing at a certain point that our time together was dwindling, and then being with her in the last 7 days of her life, as day by day I knew that each could be her last. And I think often in our culture it's difficult to talk about death or grief. I felt that after her death. There weren't many places to put what I had lived through. And I knew that I needed to take these experiences that I had had and turn them into something that was meaningful, not just for me, but for other people who had been through that experience. My mother had a line that she often said. She said, "We are here to take the pieces of the universe that we have been given, to burnish them with love, and to return them in better shape than we have received them."
Tikkun olam.
Yes. And she had gone through great difficult experiences in her life, and her work was about using those experiences to help other people who had been through something similar heal. And my ambition and hope for this book was that I would take all the pain and grief and loss and write a story in which the love would be larger than all of those things, and in which I could take you as a reader into those last days of her life, and you could be there with me. It would be bearable because that love would be greater than the difficulty of seeing someone's last days.
I think you did that. You know, I lost my own mother to cancer, and I felt that. It's hard to write a book this sincere and this honest in a world where there's a different set of values that is usually extolled, especially as an artist, Tell me about that decision did you struggle at all with the sense of wanting to be so earnest in your approach and in your aspiration?
No. And part of the book deals with the experience of growing up in upstate New York, far away from the center of culture, and my experience when I was young of really how terrible this was for me, how it created so many obstacles to being the artist that I want to become. But now as an adult, something that I appreciate is my great gift is my provincial naivete. I mean,
you and Julian Sorrell.
Well,
you do mention Red and the Black. I wanted to talk to you about it, but we're going to talk about your book, not Julian Sorrell's.
But you know, I didn't come across the idea that irony was an artistic virtue until I went to college. I mean, I really didn't. Mm-hmm. So I was naive enough to think that the purposes of art, literature, should be the essential questions in our lives. Love, intimacy, memory, purpose, meaning, how we find these things. And that is how my mother lived. It's what she believed in. And it wasn't a decision to write an earnest novel. I don't think I could write an ironic novel. I wouldn't know where to begin.
It's less about it being ironic and more about just the full embrace of the question, the yearning to express it, and the vulnerability that entails.
No, but I had to write about those things. Mm-hmm. So I needed the book so badly.
Not your first book, though.
No.
You wrote another book.
Yeah, two others. I spent my 20s writing novels that weren't worthwhile.
So one is not born fully formed at the 92nd Street Y on September 19th, 2025, with a novel that everybody wants to read.
I think it takes at least a decade to be an overnight success.
Tell me about the decade of... That's a very familiar line. I think you've said that to me before. Yeah. Tell me about that decade.
It was really about my own desire to travel far from home. I mean, I really didn't leave upstate New York until I was 19. I did a year abroad at Oxford at that age, and from that moment onward, I realized I want to be a part of the world, the conversation that I'm encountering for the first time. So in that decade, I lived in England, Berlin, Jerusalem. I was accumulating experiences. I wanted to be part of the conversations that I grew up as a teenager dreaming about. I wanted to meet other people who were devoted to ideas. And so I spent that period of my life just hungry to meet anyone who could help me more deeply understand myself and the world around me. And I wrote two novels which I'm extremely grateful that nobody wanted to publish. Because, and this is part of the book, because they were, I mean, maybe some things worked on a technical level, I don't know, but they lacked a depth, a sense of soul. They lacked...
Well, why? I'm curious. I mean, so that's another, it's sort of a way of beginning to try to wend my way to the question of what changed.
Because I thought that a great novel was centered on a powerful concept, on a grand idea, because I'd read too much French theory. And what I had to understand was that a worthwhile novel is drawn from what we've lived through, from our emotion, from the people who've made us who we are. That's why the acknowledgement section is so long. But what was really missing was coming into a more complete understanding of the woman who had raised me and who my mother was. There's a moment where Evan realizes that he has to abandon these earlier works and he has to write a book that's drawn from his mother's wisdom.
When did your mother was very wise, and she had unique combination of vulnerability and authority. I don't know how else to put it. It's very, 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 very unique. And you said to me back there that at some point you realized that you had to write about your mother's wisdom. At what point did you realize? I mean, you know, usually we look at our moms and we're like, they're not wise. At what point did you realize, oh, she's wise?
Well, I think I had to make a secondary realization, which, you know, like any child, coming into understanding that my mother had great wisdom was a slow process. There wasn't one moment, but what I did have to realize was that her wisdom was a worthwhile subject, that could be a subject for literature. And I think I only understood that after her death, because that was the first time that I had to really start living by what she had taught me without her there. I had to become a more careful student of her life. Right? When I was trying to understand what to do with my own grief, I had to ask myself, what had she done with the difficult experiences of her life? And it was that process. And I also had to think about what my mother valued in works of art. She was someone who believed deeply that literature, theater, music, poetry could help us understand how to live. So after she died, I'd been living abroad for years. I come home, right? I'm there with her at the end of her life, and then she's no longer there, and I'm in this house that I grew up in. I'm now 26. Right? She's not there. And I had this feeling, I'm not going back. I'm not going back to England. That's my prior life. I have to move forward. I have to make sense of this experience. And it was a moment of great precarity and vulnerability in my own life. Because I was 26. I didn't want to be in a house alone in the woods. But I knew that if I didn't grieve thoroughly, if I didn't think deeply in that moment about who I wanted to be as a person and as an artist, I was going to go through the rest of my life not in touch with my own emotion. I don't think you can write from that place.
Dylan has a major realization because of Rabin and your mom and Evan's mom. And what is that realization? What does he come to understand in that period?
That, well, he comes into this moment feeling that for him to make worthwhile music, he has to go back to Blonde on Blonde. He has to go back to this earlier period of his life. And his realization is that he has to write from the emotion of what he's experiencing. His marriage is falling apart. He's dissatisfied with his own music. Those are the subjects. He's asking himself if he can fall in love again. He has to write from the intensity of his own emotions. Norman Rabin had a line, right, where he'd say, art as a way of life, right? That means that the artwork and the life have to be in concert, right? He didn't just mean you only live for your art. No, he meant you make worthwhile art out of what you have lived, and not what you've lived 8 years ago. That's what Dylan had to come to terms with.
How did writing about Bob Dylan change your feeling about Bob Dylan?
I think, you know, he's an artist who people want to feel close to. They want to feel that they own him or possess him. He's theirs. People, especially who grew up listening to his music. Now, part of what was interesting about my mother's account is that you'd be in the same room with him, all right? And you still can't possess him. You're sharing the same bed with him. His mind's on his music. That's where he is, right? And they have a parting of the ways when she realizes she's playing Hedda, he's writing Blood, and after he records Blood, she thinks, okay, now we're going to have quiet time together. And that thought lasts about a minute. And then she realizes, no, he's on to the next work of art. He can give me love songs, but not love. Right? And she comes to a moment after playing Hedda, where she feels Hedda is a person who doesn't know how to heal herself. And my mother starts to feel that the love that she needs in her life, she's not going to find it on the stage. She's not going to find it in a relationship with someone who's completely relentlessly devoted to their own art as a way of life. She wants love as a way of life.
Beautiful. Boy from the North Country. Tell me about the title.
Well, the easy thing is it's a reference to the Dylan song.
Sure. We did talk about this question, so.
But there's something deeper there that's more than just the reference to the song. You know, a boy from the North Country is someone who grew up a bit further afield, who yearns to come to a place where there's culture and, as we were saying, find a fuller version of themselves. Of course, I'm writing about myself. That's Dylan's story. In a way, it's my mother's story. She's a boy from the North Country, but there are other boys from the North Country here. There's Norman Rabin, who's born in the shtetl in Ukraine, and there's Marc Chagall, who's in the background of this book. And Chagall is an artist I think about so often because he grows up in this small shtetl in Belarus. His parents are illiterate. By the time he's in his early 20s, he's found himself at the center of Parisian modernism. And what does he do in that moment? What are the paintings that first gain him any sort of attention? Well, he paints the shtetl that he's from. He paints Belarus. He paints the fiddler on the roof. He paints these intimate scenes of his childhood, or that kitchen table, that world. But he can only see Vitebsk, the town he's from, through the lens of Paris. I can only write about Goshen because I left. I can only understand that everything I am. I mean, when I was in my 20s, I thought, oh, I'm interesting because I've, gone to Oxford and lived in Berlin and traveled around. No, everyone's done that. Everyone's lived abroad. Right? Now, at this point in my life, I realized that didn't make me who I am. What made me who I am was growing up on 14 acres in the woods with a mother who put books in my hand every morning and who somehow managed to conceal the internet from me until I was 11 or 12. And everything that went into the writing of this novel, the time, the willingness to sit at that desk for those, and I started writing that first novel when I was in college, so really it was 15 years between that and this. Right? That came from being raised in a world in which what was valued most was creative expression, right? And this is a tribute to that world, right? And looking at it through adult eyes and understanding what it was in my mother's life that made her want to live in the woods with chickens and sheep and dogs and a very charming horse. Can I say one more thing about the North Country?
You can say a lot of things.
The North Country, it's also, it's Basho's narrow road to the deep north. The North Country, of course, it's a geographic place. It's upstate New York, or, in Dylan's song, it's, northern Minnesota. But the North Country it's a mythic place. It's the place we come from. It's the place we're going to. It's how we understand who we are. It's the story that we choose to tell of our own lives. That's what the North Country is.
It's beautiful. There is an extended section here about you and Evan in college, and very inspiring. It was one of the passages that made me sort of cry, just because it reminded me so much of the yearning, the young man wanting to write and wanting to amount to something and say something meaningful and do something meaningful. And I'm just going to read the very end passage here because I find it really quite remarkable. In a lecture on Kierkegaard, a professor with white hair said, "Read until you understand this. We can only become ourselves by renouncing ourselves. We can only act independently when we give ourselves to the divine. Divinity was in the books piled on my desk. Divinity was in the conversation that flowed into common rooms, dining halls, debating societies, pubs. What is beauty? What is truth? What is the purpose of art? I knew the answers were in the night air, and we could talk our way to them. Every idea was ripe with meaning. By discussing purpose, we could create it. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
What was the last thing we were going to talk about before we went to questions? We talked about it back there.
There was one paragraph
That's
toward
right.
the end that I was going to read.
Do you remember? Oh yeah, 283, here we go.
So, by way of introduction, you asked about the experience of writing intimately about the end of my mother's life. And what I wanted to capture was not just the experience of being in the hospital and the emotional intensity of that, but also looking at her and realizing this was the last time I was going to do that. And this passage is about understanding how I'm going to go forward from this experience. The only way to live would be to tell. There was no alternative to memory and to story. It was only through recollection that I would be able to recreate the intimacy I felt now in these fleeting hours, when I could still press my hand to my mother's gaunt cheek or place my fingers in hers and feel myself involuntarily absorbed by the rush of memory conjured by the primordial touch of my skin against hers. For no matter how long I lived, or the distance I roamed from my origins, or the person I became, what could ever compare to the touch of my mother's skin, my first and most enduring impression of this world, the body from which I was born and, like a memory, like a story, passed on imperfectly into the world.
Friends and neighbors, please. Questions? No comments. Questions?
So the portrait of the mother, and I want to make a distinction between the real mother and the mother in the book for this question, and you can answer it any way you want to. The portrait of the mother and son is extremely beautiful, tender, almost sort of Renaissance portrait of a Madonna and child at a different age. So this extraordinary woman, wise, beautiful, suffering, fragile, and authoritative, as you said, is dying, and her son wants desperately to know who his father was. And she has his suspicions, and they've been talking toward that. She won't say. So I'd like you to sort of address this, what was to me as the mother of, as the single mother of an only son. And I thought about my own deathbed and what I would say about his father. It's a deep mystery to me.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Early in the book, Evan asks June. He's just learned that June and Dylan saw one another the year before Evan was born. And he asks point blank, is he my father? And she says, who is there for you? When you suffer, when you thrive, who is there to love you as you deserve to be loved? And that's her answer to the question. And it takes Evan the remainder of the novel to understand why that's enough of an answer.
Thank you. Did I see it? Yes. Yes, sir. I'll repeat the question.
Great, thank you. You've talked a lot about art and artists, musicians, actors. This is also a book in conversation with other writers, and there's an incredible moment towards the end where you list all of the Jewish writers and artists that, for you capture some important part of your identity. So could you just talk a little more about who are the writers you were responding to in this novel? Who are the writers you were reading when you were writing this? Who are the writers who shaped what you felt, this is what a real work of fiction or real work of art ought to be?
I'll just say something about that scene before I answer the question. So that scene is based on an experience I had with my mother in the hospital, which is that a Chabad rabbi comes to our room without knocking and sort of marches toward my mother to offer her, religious rites, knowing that she's dying. And in real life, I rather impolitely asked him to find another room to enter without knocking. But what I wish I had done, and what Evan does in the novel, is explain to him, you have a feeling of the divine that is religious. But for me and for her, the essence of our Jewish identity is literature. It's artistic, right? It's the great tradition of narrative that has been passed down from the Torah forward. And so, as you say, I then list, and I sort of say to this rabbi, like, have you read Kafka? And so with that said, well, it's never polite to, compare oneself to other writers, so this is no comparison, but the writers who are my, so to speak, Western Wall, where I go to pray, the first would be Marcel Proust. I think that In Search of Lost Time is the most astounding human accomplishment of transforming all that one has lived into a work of art that elevates every detail into something that is larger and more beautiful and more meaningful than itself. So that is a writer that I return to again and again. And another novelist I thought of often while I was writing this was Amos Oz. I think that his A Tale of Love and Darkness is one of the most moving accounts of a son writing about a mother. He wrote that book in his early 60s, and his mother died when he was 12. And throughout that book, he orbits her. He sees her from the perspective of his childhood, from the perspective of the 12-year-old who feels so deeply betrayed by her suicide. He sees her from the perspective of being the age at which she died in her late 30s, and he sees her from the vantage point of being old enough to have been her father at the final age at which she lived. And those are two writers who meant a great deal to me while I was writing this book.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that your mother realized she could only get love songs and not love from the Bob Dylan character. And I wondered if you could speak to her successes and failures in that front. Did she then go on to find love romantically in the son during her lifetime, in the son after her death, in herself? What happened to her love?
Well, it's a beautiful question. Thank you. My mother was also a writer. She wrote essays in the regional newspaper where we lived, and one of the essays that matters most to me is called Thoughts on Love from a Happy Woman. And she wrote this in her early 60s, and she reflects in that essay on the experience of feeling that she has never fully found romantic love, and yet knowing that her life is complete with love. My mother had deep and loving relationships with me and my sister, with her siblings and parents, and with the animals in our lives, and with the many, many clients. My mother worked as a holistic health practitioner, and so she was drawing on training in psychology and what we would describe now as sort of wellness culture. And she was working very intimately with people who would bring her deeply personal problems, almost akin to a therapist. And she had immense love in those relationships. And she was someone, I find this deeply inspiring in her life, who could find love anywhere. I mean, she would talk and sort of, she would talk poetically about the love that she felt with her dog. And she really had a very loving relationship with her dog. It was extraordinary. So her life was filled with love from other people and just countless sources. And thank you for that question.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Sam. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the apartment that you live in. Having like layers of time and history, your story happening today and your mom's story happening 50 years ago, and how that has affected you, like not so much as a writer, but as a person.
So if you didn't hear, the question was about the apartment. I think places are layered so deeply with meaning. The meaning that we choose to see in them, the meaning that we feel within them. Now, of course, I didn't know my mother before I was born. And the way that I understand who she was in that period of life is through her stories. But being able to live in this apartment where she lived at the same period of her life, it feels like space and time collapsing. I almost feel like we've lived there together. She would talk to me about that period of her life, and she would say, oh, and then I hung out with a friend on the fire escape. And so sometimes on a summer night, there I am on the fire escape with her, or she talked about going to the branch of the Yorkville Public Library around the corner. I work in that library sometimes. And I write in this apartment where I know that she practiced her lines. And there's just a depth of intimacy there that has been magical for me. And I feel her very deeply in that apartment.
We're not going to ask how much rent you're paying. But everybody's wondering. I think we might have time for two more. So, yes, ma'am, please.
Hi, Sam. My question is, you were reflecting about how your time in Europe and your travels shaped what you thought you needed as an artist and a writer. And then you kind of, when your response about the North Country, when you came home, you realized everything you needed was at home. Do you think there was any part of your wandering stage that you took back with you that you also brought in there?
Oh, thank you. It's a wonderful question. Absolutely. The book is a merging of those two periods of my life. And, what Ayad was reading about that scene at Oxford as a college student where I'm reading everything I can. I mean, of course, I think the way that I would put it is that the book is merging the intellectual realizations of the first half of my 20s, which was lived abroad, with the emotional realizations of the second half of my 20s after my mother's death, when I was back in Goshen. And the work really comes out of the meeting point of those two experiences. And I think I had just felt that it was enough. If I read and study other great writers, then I can write something worthwhile. That's what I thought. And I didn't realize how deeply I needed to draw on the experiences of my childhood, on the uniqueness of the world that my mother had cultivated.
A final question, friends. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, one of the earlier questions made me wonder really, when you talked about, what you said to the rabbi and what you thought you should have said to the rabbi or could have said to the rabbi. How, writing a novel that's life-based, how
Well, I knew what the essence of the story was, and I knew that there would be no tinkering with those essential truths and experiences of my life. But what I had to learn in writing this novel was that it was only possible to convey those truths if I was willing to relinquish my own attachment to certain sort of minor factual experiences of my own life, right? So for example, I compressed my college experience. I transferred as a college student. When I first wrote the book, I included that. And I wrote about both places where I studied. And then I realized, why am I writing this? Because it happened to me? It's not a good enough reason. It doesn't serve in any way the essential truth of the story. It's distracting. So I compressed those two university experiences into one, right? So I took those sorts of liberties. And with the rabbi, there's the deeper essential truth about my identity, my mother's identity, that I want to convey. So in a moment like that, I'm very willing to sort of make literature out of this experience that I had with the rabbi. And there are other aspects like that, but what's important, what I had to learn artistically is that all of that tinkering must serve the essence of the story.
I think you did that very well, Sam Sussman. Thank you. One little final comment. For me, because when I was about your age, I was at the 92nd Street Y, and I saw WGC Bald with Susan Sontag. And I was so moved. It was like a high water mark in my I want to be a writer phase of my life. And I thought it was such a remarkable. I was sobbing, actually. I was sobbing because I was so moved, and I was sobbing because I thought, I'm never going to get there. I'm never going to get on that stage. And it's very moving for me to have known you. And yeah, you've asked me over the years to, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I've always basically said, you got to figure it out on your own, Sam. And you did. And how beautiful. You wrote such a beautiful book. And here we are at the 92nd Street Y. This young man in the book says at various points, am I ever gonna be the writer I want to be? And I hope that you can take from this audience tonight, the answer to that question is yes, you have become that writer. And it is very